This morning, we are going to continue our series, and we've been talking about Exodus, and we've been talking about Exodus as a concept, as not just a book in the Bible, but as this grand narrative that connects the fall, right? Genesis chapter 3, the fall, all the way to the cross, and even into Revelation and the culmination of all things, and how God is going to make his kingdom present here on this earth, and he is going to be here with us at all times. And we've talked about how Exodus, the narrative that we're looking at, is actually connected to all of that. It's not just an isolated story. It's not just a neat example of how God does things. It's actually part of the story. And we don't want to miss that. Because too many people that I know, and I was just as guilty growing up, I went to Sunday school, I learned all the stories, but I had no idea how all of them connected together. I didn't realize that it wasn't just, the Bible wasn't just a collection of cool stories or whatever. It was actually one long story leading to something that we would call redemption or salvation. And it really, that whole story moved to that culmination. And so what we're doing is in the book of Exodus, we are seeing how God began the process and introduced us to this idea of redemption and a covenant people, a people that are his, for his kingdom, that are restoring creation to where it was at the beginning. And that's exactly what's going on in our text. And as we move through this, we hit this chapter 5 and chapter 6 today of Exodus. And honestly, I wish I wasn't such an expert on this section, because it's basically about how when we're doing what we think is exactly right, and it's an epic failure. And it just doesn't work out the way we thought it would. I mean, Moses is doing everything right, and yet in chapter 5, it doesn't work. It doesn't happen. God's plan seems to be thwarted. And I wish, I wasn't so good at talking about this, but there have been many times in my life where I've run into the same thing. I mean, I'm not going to read the entire text to you. We'll just pick a few verses, but let me just tell you what happens. Moses, last week, we talked about the burning bush. We talked about the call and the name of God and how he went in the name of God and he stood before Pharaoh and he said, Pharaoh, let my people go. That's what he was supposed to do. He goes back and he meets with the elders of Israel, of the Israelites, and he does those signs that we talked about, the snake, the staff, the hand, the leprosy, all that stuff, and they believe. It says they believe that, yes, we believe in you, Moses. Go to Pharaoh, request our freedom. And so he does. And he goes in chapter 5 and he stands before Pharaoh and he risked everything. But he can feel that this is what's supposed to happen. And everybody's on board and he walks in and he goes up to Pharaoh and he says, God has asked that you let his people go so that they can go into the wilderness and worship him. And you can hear, the music building, and you've got Pharaoh standing there and Moses standing there, and you just know that Pharaoh is going to say, yes, and everything works out. But he doesn't. Pharaoh says, no. And the music just goes, Arr! And Moses is like, what? But God told me to come say this to you. I was supposed to come here. I was going to stand in front of you and I was going to say, let my people go. And you were going to say yes. And everything was going to be wonderful. I thought this is the way it was supposed to go. But it doesn't. And on top of that, Pharaoh not only says no, and then he turns and he looks at him and says, you know what? If those people have enough time to think about worshiping their God, then they've got way too much time on their hands. They must be lazy. I need to give them more work to do. So, they're supposed to be making bricks and they're supposed to be doing all this hard labor. And the way you make bricks is you mix the mud and the dirt and the straw and you get all that together. And instead of making sure that we provide all that straw, because we're so generous, forced labor, but we do give you some of the supplies, we're going to take a step and we're going to eliminate the straw. You got to collect your own straw, go out and find it wherever you can, and bring it in, but you don't get to lower the number of bricks that you make, because obviously you got plenty of time on your hands. I mean, if you got time to think about worshiping your God and freedom and all that, then we need to keep you working hard. So he doubles his workload. And he says, we're just going to beat you even more if you don't keep doing what you're supposed to do. So here's Moses, doing what God called him to do, being obedient, trying to be a leader, trying to step up, trying to do what God asked him to do. And it fails miserably, blows up in his face. Boom. Now, he's not only gone back to Pharaoh's court where he was wanted for murder, now the very group that he had come to represent aren't real happy with him because he just doubled their workload because he did this. And they go to him and they say, "What are you thinking? We thought you were the one. We thought you were going to do this. We thought God was working through you. We thought this was how salvation would happen. We thought this was the way we would be redeemed from slavery and we would be freed. But no, instead, you screwed it up. And you doubled our workload." So here's Moses. He's lost. And I kind of know how he feels, because there are times, and I bet you do too, I'm sure there are times that you thought, I'm doing everything right, this is the way it should be, blows up in your face. You look back and you're like, well, I obeyed God, I did what God said, I really thought this was the way it was supposed to turn out. And it doesn't. I mean, I can think over the years of programs or ministries or things that I've tried to start, and we were doing it, we prayed about it, we did the right things, we followed all the nice little leadership guides that people have written, we did the seminars, we did everything right, and at the end we had to have that gut check meeting where we go, you know what, we really tried this and it ain't working. We thought we were doing everything right, we thought this was it, but it's failing. And that's not a fun meeting. Anybody ever been in a meeting like that where you're sitting around going, we were going to try something, and woo, that just blew up in our face? That is not fun. Especially when you're the point leader and you're the one that was supposed to make sure it worked. That's no fun. And yet that's right where Moses is. Now, for me, as I was studying this, it kind of was a little bit of an encouragement, because if I look through Scripture, and especially Moses, the greatest leader of all time when it comes to Israel, when it comes to all this, he was amazing. And he experienced a pretty epic failure in his first go-around, and several more as the story goes on. But in this instance, he experienced falling flat on his face in front of God and everybody. And if you read through the rest of Scripture over and over and over, you know what you see in God's leaders and the people that God uses for amazing things? They've all got failure in their resume. They've all got a point where they tried to do something and it blew up in their face. And so what I want to do today is talk about this idea of what happens when it didn't work. When we felt the call, when we did what we thought we were supposed to do, and it just didn't work. So the first thing I want to do is just pull out a couple of lessons that I think we need to learn from an epic fail. And the first one is very simple: failure happens. It does. Sometimes you just don't get it right. Moses in Exodus 5:4, he goes and he does everything God says, and what does Pharaoh say? No, not going to do it. Was that within Moses' power to control? No. Could he have done anything differently? Probably not. He did exactly what God said to do, and it didn't work. Failure happens. You got to understand that. You're not going to get it right every single time. There will be times that you do everything right, and it still doesn't work. And that's okay. Your job is to be obedient, not to get it right every time. Your job is to be faithful, not necessarily to be perfect, not necessarily to be successful. Because failure happens. Every great leader in the Bible experienced failure. It's part of life. It's part of trying. It's part of developing. That's what it means to grow as a leader, is to try something that doesn't work and then learn from it. But that does lead to the second lesson here is not only does failure happen, but failure doesn't define you. In verse 21 of 5, is the Israelites say to him, "The Lord look on you, Moses, and judge." Moses, it's your fault, you're to blame, you're the one, you're a failure, because you have made us stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. The people look at Moses and say, "Moses, all you are is a failure. You stink, and you made us stink because you stink and you represent us." And they said, "That's who you are." But it's not. Moses isn't the one to blame here. As a matter of fact, really, no one was. Except maybe Pharaoh. But the people wanted to blame somebody, and so they blame him. But you got to understand, when you are out front, when you are leading, when you are trying to help people and you are leading them towards something, or you are trying to move them in a direction or cast a vision, there's going to be times when things don't go the way they should. And guess what? You're at the point, so you get blamed. But failure doesn't define you as a person. You may be a person who has failed, but that doesn't mean you are a failure. That's not how God sees you. If God saw everyone who failed at something as a failure, then none of the Bible would have been written. Nothing would have happened. David never would have become king. Nothing. Solomon never would have done anything worthwhile. The prophets never would have done anything to help Israel understand who God is. The disciples, talk about a bunch of bumbling buffoons. I mean, these guys were uneducated. And this is Peter, the night that Jesus just got through saying, "Peter, the night's going to come. Tonight, before morning, before the rooster crows, you are going to not deny that you even know me." And Peter's like, "Oh, no, not me. I'm big and strong. I'm Peter." And what happens? A servant girl says, "Hey, don't you know him?" What does Peter say? "No, not me." Happens again. And the third time it says, Peter actually calls down curses, denying that he knows Jesus. Talk about a failure, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but that ranks right up there with failures. And yet what does Peter do? He becomes the one who leads one of the greatest revivals ever when he preaches at Pentecost, and thousands are saved. And he leads the church through the birth of this family called the ecclesia, the church. Even though he's the one who denied even knowing who Jesus was. Failure doesn't define you. But then verse 22 and 23 tell us what to do is when failure happens, turn to God. And I don't want to sound sappy on this, but I mean, it says, then Moses, in verse 22, then Moses turned to the Lord. Now, I want you to hear what Moses said, okay? Because he could have turned to the Lord and said, "Lord, you are amazing and good, and please help." And no, you know what he does? He says, "Oh, Lord, why have you done this evil to these people?" He says, "Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." Moses goes to God and he doesn't just say, "Oh, Lord, help, because I'm really struggling." No, he goes, "God, what are you doing? I did everything you said, and you didn't do what you said you would do." Now, can you imagine talking to God like that? Can you imagine standing before God and knowing that God listens and say, "God, this is what you told me to do, and you messed it up. You didn't do it right. I was right. You were wrong. What were you thinking?" That takes some guts. Or you're really stupid, one of the two. Fine line there, right, between those two. But that's what he does. Because, see, here's the thing. When you turn to God, I'm not talking in the sappy, "Oh, dear Jesus, everything's bad. Help me out." No. I mean, I'm talking when you turn to God, you need to be willing to be authentic, to be honest, to be real, to let yourself have emotions and feelings and be frustrated and say, God, I have no clue what to do here. I thought this was where we were going. I thought this is what was supposed to happen. I thought this and it didn't work. You're going to have to help me because I don't get it. And it's okay to be upset with God. It really is. I still remember, 5-6 years ago, this couple came to the church, and they're still here. They're not here today, so I'll tell the story. And the lady came to me, and she's the sweetest lady you will ever meet. She came to me and she said, listen, this was like right before the service, okay? So this is my first time here, first time I've been back to church in forever, because me and God have had a long-standing argument, and I'm really ticked off at him, and this is his last chance. Have fun. Now, the cool thing is, you know what? They're still here and serving an amazing people. Because God isn't upset when you're upset. God's okay with the fact that you might get frustrated with him. God's okay with the fact that sometimes you look at God and say, I don't get it. I thought this was supposed to happen and this happened and I'm kind of upset right now. It's okay to be open and honest in the midst of failure, in the midst of pain, because C.S. Lewis said in his book, The Problem of Pain, well, let me just read it exactly. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. You see, when we are in the midst of pain and failure, that's when we hear from God. Because that's when we're willing to listen. Because we're already a little ticked. We're already at least saying, God, what's your problem? And that's when he talks to us. But you got to turn to him first. I mean, you can't just get mad and turn your back on him and say, well, forget it then. If it didn't work the first time, then God, you must not be real. Forget it. I'm leaving. No, it's turn to him and say, God, I thought we had a relationship. I thought there was a connection, and I'm just not getting what's going on. And I'm kind of ticked off. You got to help me. And he's perfectly fine with that. Now, if we move forward in the story a little, just so we see what's going on, that there is some things working under the surface of this failure that I think we need to identify. Because if there's one thing I've learned, the more I have experienced failure, the more I realize that sometimes it's not just a nice little black and white issue, right? It's not just a, this or that. It's not concrete. There's always layers to what's going on. Where you're like, you peel back this layer and you see this and you see that there's multiple things happening. And if we look at this failure, we can see that there was more than just Moses doing something and it not working. Because Moses did something, it didn't work, and what do the people do? They just tear into him. And I think there's a reason behind this. And hopefully when you experience failure, when you experience these things, you can learn to step back and peel back some of the layers to see maybe what's going on underneath. Because if we go back to chapter 4, we see that Moses stood before the people and he did those miracles, and the people put their faith in Moses to free them. And when Moses went to Pharaoh and it didn't work, they turned on Moses. Because their faith was in Moses, not in God. Because Moses is the one they saw. And that's why later in chapter 5, they really tear into him. Because he was the focus of their faith, not God. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the parables of the soils that Jesus talks about in Matthew 13. Right, where the seed is scattered, and some of it is choked out because it really didn't have any depth or root. And I think that's what's going on here. Is the people, they didn't have any depth to their faith yet. And so they were upset. But here's the thing, as we finish this passage, we see that even in the midst of this seemingly epic failure, and this is the thing you got to remember, God doesn't give up on his people. In all of this, whether they're upset with Moses, whether Moses is yelling at God, in all of this, you've got to hear this. God doesn't give up on his people. That's why he says in verses 6 through 8 of Exodus 6, he reaffirms this covenant to the people. Let me just read that text, and then let's break it down. He says, say therefore, this is God telling Moses, after Moses has whined and complained and all that stuff, and, oh God, this is horrible, how could you do this? You've caused these bad things, yada, yada, yada. God says, okay, listen, Moses, go back to the people, you tell them this. I am the Lord, Yahweh, we talked about that last week, his name. And I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. He reaffirms the covenant with them. He said, yeah, this little setback happened, but I'm not done. You're seeing this little part of the story, and yeah, that didn't look good, but you're missing the big picture. I'm not done, and I'm not giving up on you. Pharaoh looking at me saying no is not going to, you don't hear God going, oh, Pharaoh said no, rats, what are we going to do? He's God. He's like, I got bigger plans here. This is not going to, I know it's not going to be easy. I know it's not going to be simple, but I knew that. I'm with you. And this covenant, it's actually a covenant. It's in the form of a covenant. It even begins, and we'll see this in the next section, how it almost looks like a wedding process, okay? But he makes this covenant with them, this promise to them, and there's three parts to it. And the first part is who is in charge. It lays out the terms right away. I am the Lord. I'm in charge. I'm doing this. There's no one else. I'm the one who's taking full responsibility. And then it says what he's going to do. And there are three things that he's going to do in this text. Verse 6 says that he is going to redeem them. He's going to buy them back out of slavery. He's going to free them. He's going to redeem them. And then verse 7 says he's going to adopt them. Bring them into his family. Make them part of his family. Not just, he's not just going to redeem them from slavery into slavery to him. Because that's an option. And if he's God, he could do that if he wanted. He said, no, I'm going to redeem you out of slavery, and I'm going to adopt you as my people, as my family. And then the third part, in verse 8, he says, I'm going to house you. I'm going to give you a possession, a land, a place to live. And so he tells Moses, go tell the people that. Now, we know how the story goes, because we're reading it 4,000 years later, okay? And we know that, yeah, ultimately he does. But put yourself in the sandals of Moses for just a second. He's supposed to go back to the people and say, yeah, I know it didn't work the first time, but God said he's not done. And here's what he's going to do. He's going to redeem us. He's going to adopt us. And then he's going to house us. And he had to say, do you believe that? Will you stick with me when it gets hard? Because this is God working, not me. Will you trust that? And here's why that's important, because if we fast forward through the Old Testament into the New Testament, where we see Jesus come, and Jesus comes as the Son of God, and he lays down his life, right? And he says, this is the covenant. And matter of fact, he says when he's giving people communion, right, at the Last Supper, he says to them, this is the new covenant of my blood. The first was the covenant of the law. This one now is a covenant of my blood. It's a promise. It's something I'm going to do. But here's the cool thing. If you go to Galatians 4, verses 4 and 5, it copies exactly what this covenant that God made with his people 2,000 years prior. He says, I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to adopt you as my sons, as my daughters. Think about that. Jesus, 2,000 years later, 1,400 years after God made this promise, says, in this covenant I'm going to establish with you, the church, my people. I'm going to redeem you from sin, from the slavery of death that holds you, that will not let you go, that keeps you down because you were not made to be like that. But sin has taken over, and I'm going to buy you back out of that. I'm going to redeem you with my blood, and then I'm going to adopt you. I'm not just going to bring you in so you can be some slave. I'm not going to bring you in so that I can control you. It's kind of the opposite. I'm going to bring you in so that you can be my family. And then in John chapter 14, he goes even further and he says, not only am I going to redeem you, not only am I going to adopt you, but he says, in my Father's house are many rooms, and I'm going to make one for you. I'm going to house you. I'm promising you a land, a possession, a place. And so we read Exodus and we say, oh, that's nice. He saved a bunch of people from slavery. No. This is how God works in redeeming all of creation. He redeems, he adopts, and then he houses. He gives us a place to stay. And so the question we have to wrestle with this morning is, in the midst of times of epic failure, of times in my life where everything fell apart and I thought I'd never make it, I didn't think I would do it, I really thought everything was wrong, I thought I was doing it right, but it is falling apart, and I'm having that gut check time where I'm going, God, I thought we were in this, I thought I was doing it right, but it didn't work. We have to turn back and say, God, but I will believe that no matter what, you promised to redeem me from my sinfulness, from my failures. You promised to adopt me into your family, not as a slave, not as something you're controlling, but as just a family member, as a son or a daughter who gets to live with you in your presence, enjoying relationship with you. And I know you're preparing a place for me. But see, here's the thing. We have to reach that point where we go, God, I trust that. Even in the midst of failure, even when I don't feel like everything's going the way it should, I believe that, and I give myself to that covenant, that promise. And I step out in faith to say, God, I'm accepting that. I'm accepting what Jesus did, and I'm giving myself to that, and I'm going to live under that relationship to you. And that's the gospel. That's the good news. That Jesus says, I don't care where you are. I don't care how bad your past. I don't care how many times you failed. I don't care how many times you've denied knowing me. I don't care how many times you've yelled at me because you were upset. I don't care what you've done, where you've been, what's going on in your life. It's still there for you. And I'm just here to say, will you take it? Will you accept it? Because it's free. He wants to adopt us as his children. And if you've already done that, you've already said, God, I do believe, then you need to hear that again, that you are a child of God. Even if you are in the midst of failure, even if you feel like everything's fallen apart, you need to know God is still looking at you, not as a failure, but as his child. And he's saying, I love you. I'm proud of you. I think you're amazing. I want you to succeed. I want to be with you. I want you to enjoy this life and to experience a meaningful and significant life of living in my kingdom, of living under my rule, because I know what's best for you. Just trust me. And so this morning, that's really the thing we have to realize, is that the gospel, the good news that Jesus did all this, changes everything. Everything. It changes our failures. It changes our lives. But we have to be willing to accept it. All right, let's pray together. Lord, I know that you are good. And God, I know that you you watch over us and you take care of us and you do things that we don't even know about. And God, there are times, I know I've had those talks with you like Moses did, where I really thought I was doing everything right and it just blew up in my face and I thought I was a failure. And God, I still struggle with that. But the more I read about you and how you worked in and with your people, and the more I hear and listen to what you did with your people, the more I know, God, that you desire a relationship with us that is not based on whether I succeed or fail. It's based on what you have already done. And so this morning, God, we acknowledge that the gospel, the good news, the grace and forgiveness that you offer, it changes everything. And we acknowledge that, and we thank you for that, and we ask you this morning to help us embrace that. And God, if there are people here who have never experienced that, who have never felt that, who have never given themselves over to your relationship, to a relationship with you, God, I know all it involves is saying, I believe that and I give myself to you. I ask you to forgive me of so many wrong things I've done, and I ask you to take that and send it away and to redeem me from that sinfulness. And I am yours to be adopted into your family. And I will follow you. So God, I pray today as we just reflect on how you change us in the midst of our failure, that you would encourage us, that you would hold us, and that you would give us hope in you. In Jesus' name.